This is part 3 of the paper on African immigrant philanthropy in New York City. And I'm in the part where I give the definitions I use in the chapter. So now for refugees. Some undocumented aliens among African immigrants are also refugees. For this population, there may be little awareness of the services that exist to support refugees. Most depend on networks of friends or family, broadly defined. Some religious institutions have risen to the challenge of serving this population. Notable in terms of outreach to African immigrant communities are the Coptic Church, which has a record of service to Egyptian Copts, the Lutheran Church, and its growing record of service to refugees from Liberia and Sierra Leone in particular. While the Catholic Church has a strong record of activism on immigration issues, demonstrated by lobbying for legislative change, increases in budget allocations, expansion of rights for all immigrants, and the like, its presence in serving African refugee populations is very limited. The Christ Apostolic Church, Methodist Church, as well as several Pentecostal churches and indigenous African churches like the Aladura and Celestial Church of Christ, are examples of churches originating from Africa that have established missions in the United States. They do not, in the main, serve refugees exclusively. Today, there are several mosques in the New York City area, and some of them serve immigrants by providing information, referrals, and welfare services. And some of the immigrants they serve are African. Increasingly, African immigrants break away from African mosques and establish their own independent mosques. And today there are more of those than in 2004 when I wrote this, when this chapter was published. So they established their own independent mosques with imams from the various African countries from which the immigrants originate. Necessarily, these institutions also serve a multi-purpose function. Many have become involved in refugee servicing by default and ought to be supported in institutionalization of their services. Many who are familiar with New York City are also aware of the wide reach of Yoruba religion. While most of the visible believers in this indigenous West African religion are Africans from the diaspora, there's a growing number of Babalawo diviners, that is, especially from Nigeria in the United States. Some non-religious organizations also serve the immigrant refugee population. In the New York City, these include African Services and Rainbow. African Services still exists, Rainbow does not. The services provided are crucial, but their reach is limited. However, the extent to which these services that are offered are adequate, the extent to which the information on their availability is widely disseminated in the target population, and the extent to which these organizations are effective ought to be subjected to serious study and independent assessment. The healthcare needs of the refugee population include not only access to physical care, but equally, if not more importantly, access to mental care. Many refugees are newly escaped from harrowing devastating situations that have profound, lasting negative consequences on their psyche. Psychological counseling and psychiatric care is needed to ensure that this population makes an adjustment to normal life in their community of settlement. Groups of refugee children have been brought into the US from the war-torn countries of Sudan, as well as groups of amputated children and youth from Sierra Leone. The amputations were done by combatants in the wars that forcibly recruited children and inflicted such traumatic injuries on them deliberately. This was during the war in the civil war in Sierra Leone. So many are coming as a result of the successful advocacy of religious organizations. While these efforts are to be commended, there's some cause for concern. Are these children and youth provided with adequate orientation before and after their arrival? What services exist to support them? Under whose supervision are they? Are there any plans to help them determine if their parents or close relatives are alive? And if so, to help them reconnect with their family? Is this a temporary solution or is it permanent? I think one could kind of look into that now because we're many years, 20 years after this paper was published. The structure and advocacy organizations, the structure of advocacy organizations may also raise some concerns. Why are so many organizations top-heavy with native-born non-African Americans, excluding recent African immigrants who would have been a logical interest group upon whose expertise and knowledge-based advocacy organizations can rely? Are recent African immigrants involved in any advocacy efforts? Yes, they are, is the short answer, but not nearly enough. Are there any Africans with expert knowledge of issues concerning refugees? Yes, indeed, but they're hardly ever consulted. The answers to these questions would reveal what appears to be enduring bias against recent African immigrants. There seems to be an underlying belief that recent African immigrants could not possibly contribute anything to discourse, advocacy, or outreach to refugee populations from their own continent and countries. If one considers that African immigrants are also among the most educated immigrants and most educated Americans, then we are faced with the problem of explaining why the lacunae exists. So I will talk about exiles next, but we'll take a break right now.